This is Merchant's Row from Bar Mills Models, and this was a limited run kit from December of 2022. There was also what you might call an enhanced version of this kit called Rickety Cove, which was the same set of buildings but also added some docks so you could build them lakeside or seaside. The kit is basically 5 small buildings, and it's sort of set up that you build 2 pairs of buildings, so you kind of end up with 3 pairs built as 5 buildings, if that makes sense. As I said, this was a limited run kit, but if you're watching this years in the future, you might be able to find it on eBay. They show up once in a while. This is mostly a pretty easy build. There are some areas that are a little bit tedious or a little bit difficult, and there are some mistakes in the instructions. I think when they make these kits, they only ever go through sort of one test build or test run of the instructions. And so they even note in the instructions that there could be mistakes. It's just something you have to watch out for. I'm going to try and go into a fair amount of detail on this build of my techniques, more than I do in most of my videos. The goal is to make this a good video for beginners getting started with craftsman kits. And even though this set of buildings is no longer available, the same techniques can be applied to pretty much any of the other Bar Mills buildings or any of the other craftsman kit lines. The techniques for these builds are all basically the same, but sometimes the materials are different. For example, in this kit, you're going to get a certain type of shingles. Some other kit may have different types of shingles. These are the 2 buildings that I'm going to build in this video. This is the Jenkins, which is the building on the left, and then the other building is Hawkins on the right. So we're going to start with Jenkins. Originally, I was only going to build Jenkins for this video, but then as I got towards the middle of it, I decided to add in Hawkins as well. So that's why there's 2 buildings. This is the package of most of the laser cut wood pieces. I'm starting with the Jenkins building. One of the first things I want to do is go through the instructions and mark the part numbers on each of the pieces. When you first open up the bag of pieces, it can be a little overwhelming with the number of parts that there are, so this just makes it easier to prevent any kind of mistakes. When I build these kits, I have a tendency to skip over a lot of the instructions, but on this kit, you really do want to read the instructions and kind of pay attention to what's going on. It really will help out and will probably prevent some mistakes. The next step in almost any of these builds is to start adding bracing on the walls. And the reason you do this is, for one thing, the walls are not all that strong. And for a second thing, if you use acrylic paint, the water in the acrylic paint can start to warp the walls. So you really want to strengthen up the walls. The kit includes a bracing diagram, and you want to be sure to follow it and be careful that your bracing is not going to interfere with some other part of the construction. In particular, you want to pay attention to how far down on the wall the bracing goes, because you need to leave some room at the bottom for the base of the building. The kit includes plastic windows, and here what I'm doing is taping them down onto a piece of cardboard so that I can spray them with primer. And I'm going to use Tamiya primer to prime the plastic windows and then paint them with Vallejo paints. Another thing that you want to do that's a really good idea is to take a piece of fine steel wool, I think this is 4/0 steel wool, and run it over any of the wood pieces that come with the kit. Not the walls, but just like the sticks. And this removes any of the splinters that might be hanging off the sticks. Those things really show up when you paint the wood. Here I'm applying the trim pieces to these walls. This is kind of a mistake. I'm going to have to cut it off later because I should have shingled the wall before applying these corner trim pieces. I realized at this point I should have applied the corner trim pieces to the walls after I put on the shingling, so I'm cutting off the trim pieces and I'll put them back on after I do the shingling. Here I'm applying the shingles to the walls, and this was a little bit tricky and this was kind of tedious. Sometimes they didn't quite come off the sheet as well as I would have liked. Sometimes they would tear, but they were actually pretty sticky, and Here I'm applying them to the wall with a tweezer, and then I just kind of tear off the excess. Fortunately, there are some lines to help you keep the shingle lines straight on your wall. I finished shingling the walls, and this is where I ran out of shingles. So they don't give you enough shingles to do all the walls, which to me is really an unacceptable mistake for a kit at this price. So that's kind of aggravating. Looking at the layout, I think that this whole wall is hidden by the other building anyway, so it doesn't really matter, and that's why I did this one last also. But there's some gaps here. It doesn't look that good, but I think I'll find some way to cover it up. And I wasted some, but I don't think I wasted enough to cover this. So it's like if you want to cover that whole wall, you got to do absolute perfection with the shingling. So anyway, that's where it stands. Yeah, so it doesn't really matter because that one wall was completely covered up by the other building. If you were to separate those two buildings, it would be a problem. And then the other sort of gap areas where the shingles were kind of missing, those get covered up by other parts of the buildings. So it wasn't that big of a deal, but it would have been nice to have an extra sheet of shingles. At this point, the shingles are hanging over the sides of the walls and in the windows, and so I have to cut those out to open up those spaces. Now I can finally glue the trim on again. People always ask about these metal blocks. They're called Machinist's 1-2-3 blocks because they're 1 inch by 2 inches by 3 inches, and you can get them on Amazon. They're very useful. Here I'm putting together the dormers for the building, and this is a little bit tedious, but it's just something you have to do, and it's a really nice touch to have dormers. And these were actually pretty easy to assemble compared to some other older buildings that aren't as sophisticated. Here I'm putting together the stairs, and it's kind of hard to describe, but they have a nice way of putting together the stairs where each of the stair step sides, I forget what those are called, stringers maybe, they have like kind of a base to them, and you glue the base onto a spacer, and then that's how you put the steps on, and then you cut the base off after that. So it's a nice way to put together steps that Bar Mills has come up with. And now I'm putting on the steps. Stairs are always kind of tedious and probably tedious to watch as well, but these are not too bad. So at this point, I decided to add Hawkins in as well as another build on this video to make it a little more interesting. And so here are all the laser cut pieces for the Hawkins kit. And again, the first thing I want to do is number all of the parts on the inside, or even on the outside, since I'm going to paint over it anyway. All of these wood wall pieces are laser cut, so they come apart pretty easily. And some of the other pieces are cardboard, and then there's kind of a mini MDF that is also included with the kit, and some other sheets that have a sticky backing so you don't need glue. Kind of a variety of materials that you're going to come across. And that actually gets a little bit confusing because a part you're looking for may be made of any different type of material. And one of the weird things about the sticky backing material is sometimes I couldn't tell if there was a sticky backing or not. So it's just something that you want to pay attention to as you're going through the different types of materials in the kit. So Hawkins has clapboard walls, and so I decided to use a pounce wheel to add some nail holes. You can get a pounce wheel on eBay or different art supply stores like Hobby Lobby. And I think I'm using a 1/4 inch pounce wheel. And I'm using a piece of sheet plastic to use as a straight edge as I add the holes. And typically you want to add the pounce wheel holes along the edge of the walls and also kind of adjacent to the windows, maybe about 1 millimeter spacing from the edge and 1 millimeter from the windows. If you don't know where to add them, it doesn't really matter, but just you do want to keep the line straight, and it's a nice feature, really does enhance the building. Here are all the resin pieces and the metal pieces, so I'm getting those ready for painting. The castings on these pieces isn't really that great. The resin is pretty decent, but there's some flash. The metal had a little more flash, so I had to spend some time filing that off. For resin pieces and kits, you typically want to wash them in some water and just some dish soap to get whatever film is left over from the resin casting. You want to wash them before you do any painting. And for resin and metal, I like to prime them with, to me, a primer, the gray spray can primer. And then I like to use high quality paints on the resin and the metal. I can't really use the cheap craft store paints there. I know some people use cheap craft store paints on plastic and metal, but I've never had much success with it. For the walls, I'm going to do a slightly different painting technique than what I normally do. And again, we're working on the Hawkins build here. But it starts out with what I normally do, and that is spraying with a gray primer from a spray can, and now I'm using Folk Art Barnwood. So here, Folk Art is one of the cheap craft store paints, and you'll see a lot of brush strokes, but that's not going to matter because we're going to cover that up later. I first primed the resin and metal pieces with Tamiya primer, and now I'm painting them. And I'm using Vallejo paint because, again, I like to use the high quality paints on the resin and metal pieces. And for a brick, I'm using Vallejo Hall Red. Now we're back to the walls, and I'm using Vallejo Dark Gray Wash over the Folk Art Barnwood. I've said this before in other videos. You might think you could just use a black wash of acrylic paint, but there's something in the Vallejo wash that makes it flow better and not give water spots. I've never been able to reproduce that formula. I think it's worth spending the money for the Vallejo wash, and a bottle lasts a long time. Now we're back on the shingle building, and I kind of use the same paint technique here. The Folk Art Barnwood covered by the Vallejo Dark Gray Wash, and now I'm dry brushing with Vallejo Silver Gray. So I'm going to leave the shingled part this gray color, but then I'm going to paint the wood part. For the clapboard building, Hawkins, I'm going to paint it with a red color, and this is Americana Heritage Brick. And I'm applying it kind of lightly and kind of transparently, almost as a wash, but a little thicker than a normal wash, so that the gray does kind of show through in some patches, but for the most part, the red is covering the whole walls. I decided I wanted to have white trim on Hawkins, and so I've masked off the walls outside of the trim, and I'm using a sponge to apply some white paint on the trim areas. Just as a tip, typically when you use masking tape, you want to remove it as soon as possible while the paint is still wet. Otherwise, the capillary action will pull the paint in under the masking tape, and you won't have solid edges. Also, you might want to think twice about using a pure white and maybe use an off-white. This white looked really bright on this building, and I didn't think it looked as good as the box art covers where they use kind of an off-white. Back on the Jenkins building, I wanted to paint the board part of the walls with a color, and I'm using Americana Camel. And I'm applying it with a sponge. And when you do this, you want to have some irregular pattern to how you're applying the paint. Some areas more worn than others. And I'm saying this based on pictures I've looked at of worn paint on buildings. And also where there might be some shelter, like underneath the stair area, you want to have a more solid color of the paint. Also, when you're using a sponge like this, you want to kind of get an even layer of paint over a large area of the sponge and use a really light touch. If you press down too hard, you're going to get giant blobs of paint on the wall, and that's not what you're looking for, or it's probably not what you're looking for. For the mortar in the brickwork, I like to use this AK Interactive wash, and this is an enamel wash. It just seems to seep right in to the cracks among the bricks, and it looks pretty good. I think it's perfectly valid if you don't want to paint the mortar on brick in HO scale. I've seen a lot of instances of brick walls where it looks like the mortar is pretty faint and may not actually be visible, but you do want to give it some kind of weathering to give it some kind of character. Now it's time to assemble the Jenkins building, and this was a little more difficult than you might think, partly because it doesn't have right angles on it. But they give you a base, and the base comes pretty close to giving you the correct angles, but I still had to kind of work through some gaps. I did screw something up and had to re-glue it a couple times, and I'll explain what I did later. For the windows, I started with gray Tamiya primer, and then I painted gray acrylic paint over that, some kind of Vallejo medium gray, not sure what it was. And then I covered that with a Vallejo black wash, and now I'm applying the white trim color using a sponge. Here it's time to apply the Hawkins sign to the Hawkins building, and this is a little bit tricky because the L shape. I decided to cut it into two different pieces, thinking I could match it up pretty well together, and for the most part that worked. I used a couple pieces of wood underneath the wall to support it as I rubbed the sign onto the wall. One thing worth noting here is I put in a little piece of the second story overhang on the wall so that I can make sure I don't position the sign too far up on the wall where it gets blocked by the overhang. And then there's a part of the building that juts out below the sign, so you want to be really careful about vertically where you're going to put the sign. The other thing that's really odd in this kit, which is really kind of a mistake from the manufacturer, is that there is a small window that goes under the lower part of the sign. So I just put the sign right over the window opening, and then I cut a piece of wood to fill it in on the back side. I like to glue the sign on using just white glue, and then I burnish it into the wall using a round toothpick. And I have found that that works pretty well to not tear the sign or mar the paper. Another tip is that you want to let the sign dry for at least 24 hours and then spray it with some kind of a sealer like Tester's Dull Coat. And if you don't let it dry, it can sometimes get a kind of a misty, foggy look over the sign, over the paper. And here I'm just adding in that little piece of wood over the back part of the sign where the window hole was. The purpose of the sealer is to protect the paper sign from any damage from any washes or acrylic paint that you might add on top of it later. As I do in a lot of my builds, I printed out some pictures of curtains from the internet, and the website wayfair.com is a good source for pictures of curtains. I pasted them into a Word doc and printed them out at a reduced size, and now I just am cutting them apart and pasting them on the inside of the windows. And this is just a nice way to hide any interior that you might see of the building that you don't want visible. I just always try to find the ugliest curtains possible, you know, something my grandmother would have chosen. Now we're back to the Jenkins building, and I'm adding in the fourth wall, and I remember what didn't quite work right the first time I tried to put the walls together, and it was those roof pieces that have the rafter tails hanging out. I think they didn't quite line up correctly, and something just wasn't right about those. It took a couple tries to get that to work. Here's the roof for the shingled building, and it's kind of nice because these little strips, they have their own sticky backing, and so you just peel off the sticky backing and you stick them along where the lines are on the roof. So it goes together pretty quickly. On the other hand, for the Hawkins building, the roof is shingles, and so you have to put on these sticky strips, and it's kind of tedious, but at least there's lines to keep your shingles straight. I actually had a really difficult time gluing the roof to the Jenkins building, and I think it took 3 or 4 attempts. And so here's the first attempt, and you can see that it just didn't sit down on the walls properly. It was fine until I put on the weights, and somehow something shifted as the weights were sitting there. And so I'm just using a razor blade to cut the roof off, and then I'll just try it again. It's just one thing I like about these wood kits is how easy it is to cut them apart, typically, when you make a mistake like this. Now I'm applying the porch to the Jenkins building, and I had a little more difficulty than you might expect. Had to do some cutting and some finagling to get it to fit, and really kind of had to push it in. I think I broke the railings off a couple times doing that. Here I'm using a clamp to make sure that the porch is tight against the bottom of the entryway on the second story. These little DeWalt clamps are really useful. I think I got them at Lowe's. And here I'm applying the roof trim pieces to the Hawkins building. And I made these by first painting some strip lumber gray and then using a sponge to apply the trim color, in this case white. And now I just kind of measured out the length as best as I could, and I'm cutting them apart, and then I'll just glue them on. Here I'm cutting out the billboard signs, and what I like to do is glue them to a piece of black cardstock using spray adhesive. The cardstock works to stiffen up the sign, and then it also gives you a little bit of a side surface to glue the wood framing to. So here I have some scale lumber painted gray, and I'm gluing it onto the sides. You want to be careful not to glue the sign to your workspace. I actually did this once on this build, and it actually never happened before, but it did kind of destroy the sign. I was sort of able to salvage it, but that's why there's multiples. When I first got into these kits, I used to scan copies of the signs into the computer so I had a backup in case something went wrong, or just so I had extras. And if you're going to do that, it's a good idea to mark like 1-inch increments on the sign so that when you print it out again, you know how to scale it properly. Here I'm dry brushing kind of a medium gray color onto the shingles of the roof of the Hawkins building. And I'm also going to apply kind of a greenish gray color using a dry brush on the roof of the Jenkins building, which I guess you can't see because my hand is in the way. Here we finally get to see what the two buildings are going to look like adjacent to each other. The build's almost finished. One thing I like to do on a lot of my builds is give them a very light overspray with an airbrush of Vallejo Light Olive. This kind of mutes the colors and softens the contrast and kind of brings everything together. At this point, looking at their build and my build, the roof for the Jenkins building was kind of missing a little something, and so I decided to go back and revisit some weathering on it. And here I'm using Vallejo rust texture, and this is an acrylic, it's water-based, and I'm just kind of stippling it onto the edges using a brush that's had some of the bristles cut off. Well, you might wonder why I've cut the bristles off of a brush. When a brush gets old and kind of clumped with paint and you can't get it out, you can cut off some of the bristles down to kind of a nub, and then you can use the brush to apply weathering chalks or pastels. And now I'm adding some pigments. This is a rust colored pigment, and what I do is I dip the brush in some paint thinner, and then I just apply the pigment and let it dry. And I also did some dust colored pigments. And then once everything dries, you want to spray it with some kind of a sealer like Tester's Dull Coat to seal the pigment onto the surface. Pigments can be somewhat of a challenge to work with because when they go on wet, they don't look the same as they do when they dry. So typically once they dry, you have to come back and kind of refine them a little bit. Just dip your brush in some thinner and go back and make your touch-ups. And finally, we're at the end of the clips, and here all I'm doing is applying some dust-colored pigment to the roof using paint thinner. Thanks for watching. Here is the finished building, or almost finished. I'm probably going to touch up some mistakes because there are a few. And this is where I think I'm going to put it on the layout, although you don't really have any context to where that is. But anyway, off to the right of it is where there's going to be a swamp. You can see that little pond depression. But I'm not sure where I'm going to put these until I finish up some of the other buildings, and we'll see what happens. There you can see at the top of the red building there's some paint spots that are kind of missing. And also that little roof thing on the top of the red building, you can see that there's a little hole where the slot was supposed to be, and the tab went in the slot and it didn't quite fit right. So I might try to do something to cover that up. Not really sure yet. But anyway, there's a really interesting build. Thanks for watching. I don't know if I'm going to do build videos on the remaining buildings, but I will try to get to that. And I'm not sure when that's going to be. I've got a huge stack of other kits to get through. So hopefully it'll be coming up soon.